Hello and welcome to the NVR Podcast number 4. Today we're talking about NVR in schools, ? I'm Rachael Aylmer.
And I'm Tony Meehan.
Oh, that must have been different for listeners to have heard. It is not Peter Jakob. So yes, we have a new associate today, Tony Meehan. Would you like to introduce yourself, Tony?
Yes, I'm Tony Meehan. I am an NVR practitioner with PartnershipProjects. My background is in teaching. I spent nearly 30 years in teaching, 10 years of which I spent as head of a pupil referral unit, looking for alternative means to manage challenging behaviour.
Well, and it won't come as a surprise that today we're going to be talking a little bit about Tony's journey in schools using NVR. And I know recently, Tony, you've just completed your accreditation module in the highest level of NVR training, of which your specialism was obviously in schools and your journey. So it'd be wonderful to hear a little bit about that. But I'm sure the listeners would be really interested in how can schools adopt a different approach from the approach that they're already using? And I know you'll have lots to say about that.
Well, I think, just to hark back a little about my journey took me to a pupil referral unit. And I was looking for something different. You come across young people for whom it's very difficult to keep on punishing. There are young people out there, and I found it really difficult to just continuously going down the road of punishment. And at the pupil referral unit, we took the view that we needed something different. And we were constantly looking for something different. And when I started there, interestingly, I knew what I wasn't going to do. And that was fall back on the standard approaches to managing behaviour, but I didn't know what we were going to do. And that was a tough time because we just stopped doing certain things, the detentions, the tellings off. So we really were looking for something else. And what we found over time, this was before I encountered NVR, was surrounded by a brilliant team of staff who got that we had to do something different. And what we were doing was avoiding going down those roads I mentioned earlier. Now, what we found was interesting. Young people wanted security of adults around them. They wanted secure adults around them. And I had those. And slowly but surely, we were doing things completely different. And this was, for instance, we were doing things like striking while the iron's cold. Classic NVR mantra. And this is something we were doing. And what that meant was then staff were happy to be able to avoid just telling people off.
Yeah.
So that meant also that many staff felt, well, what are we going to do? And I'm thinking, well, I don't know yet. So gradually the journey, we got into habit of devising our own model. And eventually, Jackie, our colleague Jackie Lindeck, introduced me to NVR. And it was like, oh my God, this is what we're doing. This is what we're looking for. This is the conceptual framework we need to inform how to move forward. So that's really where we were with that.
How did you know that instinctive sense that this approach was the approach that felt right for your team?
I think because we were interested in looking for counterintuitive approaches. So when NVR came along, that just ticked all the boxes for us. And, the focus on de-escalation is really probably the most powerful aspect when you start NVR, because that's the introduction to a different way of being with children. So you don't have to react and respond to every little thing that goes on, which happens in some schools, but not in all. But there is a requirement that everything has to be dealt with. If you're now saying to staff, let it go, it's okay, we'll deal with that tomorrow, later on. And then when the iron's cold, we have that conversation with the young person, makes a huge difference. So that was the sort of the introduction to that.
When you say that, Tony, because I guess my practice is expanding now to 14 years of using NVR, for me it feels such a common sense approach. And I guess you're smiling, and I guess how with schools that aren't using that position and using their teacher presence in that way, I guess what would be the barriers, do you think, for some teaching staff?
I think many schools devise very rigorous systems to managing behaviour, and on paper they look almost foolproof, and they are designed to capture everything that the child does and therefore have a response to what the child does. Now that's at the extreme. This is what you won't be surprised to hear me say zero tolerance schools are doing. And I see the difference between zero tolerance schools and the school I would like as the difference between controlling and being in control. They are not the same thing. Controlling behavior is where you never can really let up. You have to be constantly on the alert for things that are going to go wrong. And you have to, and you're almost frightened to let the smallest things go. So escalation is almost built into that approach. And we know there is a lot of research out there that this happens. And many young people are punished for the smallest of things, which affects those young people who have difficulty regulating themselves.
That was my doorbell on your phone. Apologies.
Apologies. So sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Affecting young people who have.
Yeah. So young people who find difficulty regulating themselves naturally will find this difficult to deal with. And I suppose the issue is about how do you manage those really challenging young people who show very challenging behaviour, and not resort to these sort of controlling behaviours. And actually, I would argue those controlling approaches trigger an awful lot of that sort of behaviour in these young people. And many of them can't survive in these environments.
Yeah.
Now, I want to stress this is not all schools, but there are schools out there that have this approach.
As you were talking, Tony, as I often hold the position of parents, caregivers, I then found myself holding the position as a teacher who are caught up amongst, in the midst of those, we must control the child's behaviour. How challenging and exhausting that must be for teachers who perhaps that it doesn't sit with their own values and beliefs, but it's part of their job.
Exactly my point. The being controlling is exhausting.
Oh.
Having a sense that if I let these things go, then it is going to lead on to bigger things and I will lose control. Whereas actually, again, this all boils down to presence. And teacher presence, and Haim Omer talks about it all the time, having presence in the classroom. Young people who feel secure with someone who is very secure in themselves. So this means that, therefore, and Jaime spoke recently about this in his lecture, about how exhausting it actually is to be constantly in a controlling mode, anxious mode. And that then sends signals to young people. There is anxiety here. I feel anxious because my caregiver in the classroom is feeling anxious. And this then may trigger difficult, challenging behaviours.
Absolutely. And I think, when we're referring to vigilant care and the work that Jaime and Peter have done in that concept of NVR, how the teachers can step away from, and build alliances, just as we expect parents to, or coach parents to step away and build alliances to strengthen their voices, to validate the positions that they take. I'm just thinking about how those seeds can be planted in those environments.
I think the first thing is there has to be a leadership that's willing to use these approaches, because as we know with NVR, it is counterintuitive, and therefore many parents and teachers will find, wow, what you're letting things go. How can this lead to good behaviour? And recently I was in a school where I was talking about NVR principles and explaining how they could work in the classroom. And what I found was fascinating, because I found teachers to begin with were a little bit anxious about calling for support, for instance. Now, we know presence isn't about you chuntering along and doing it all yourself. We say in NVR, you cannot do this alone, particularly with challenging young people. So getting, showing people how to use support. And I've lifted this straight from Jaime Aylmer's book, Courageous Teachers, where you have a situation where, and I explain this to them, imagine you have this challenging pupil and you allow this child, to behave in a particular manner, and you try to manage it on a daily basis, and you have that difficulty doing that. How about you decide that you're going to try a different approach, but you don't do it on your own? You acknowledge, I need support. Now, we know with NVR, with support, it is very, very carefully laid out how the support you want. So what we discussed was that it's planned. Again, pre-planning with NVR, you plan that you're going to ignore as best as you can certain behaviours, but you have planned that somebody will drop in, and that person will offer you support by saying, are you okay? Almost ignoring the child and the class, saying to the class teacher, are you okay? Do you want me to stay here? And the teacher says, yes, could you sit there, please? Now, that is not taking over. It's not rescuing. It's not having that stern, as I was in my earlier career, stern head of year would come in and stare down those children, rescue the teacher for the 2 minutes, then go. And then things go back to normal. And what I've explained to them is, in doing this, the way you invite someone into your class, first of all, you're in control. You are in control. You instruct them where to sit. You are in control. You don't want them to intervene. You are in control. But then what you're doing is borrowing from the very presence of that person just to get on with the lesson. And then the most powerful aspect of it, I think, is after 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, saying to that person, it's okay, Miss or Mr. So-and-so, it's all good now, you can go. And then that person replies, great, I'll drop back in 15 minutes. Now, that leaves that person intact in terms of their authority, and it's building their presence. Does that make sense?
Totally. And it's interesting how you use the word. I've got this adversity to using the word control. I have to put the word self-control, self in front. And something about a teacher presenting with such certainty in his or her actions that they are using their self-control. And you also used the word ignore, which is another word I have an effect with, but adversity to use, because the teacher who enters the classroom, as we described in this mimic setup, chooses to only respond to the class teacher. So rather than, that ignoring the rest of the class or the focus child, if there is one, they're choosing to just respond to the teacher. So that other teacher coming into that arena is also practicing self-control.
Absolutely.
And then that sitting down, we now have two teachers with that alliance and that strength. Teacher A and Teacher B. Teacher B is validating Teacher A's voice. And the strength that is built within that classroom. I wonder, Tony, what you think the young people in that classroom are now experiencing when this should have, if this happened.
What I think they're feeling is a heightened degree of security. And also what I would say, and the case I'm talking about did involve a focus child.
Okay.
Confounding of expectations of that young person. Because in the past, it might have been that this child will be well used to somebody coming along and doing what I described earlier. Someone coming in to take the child out. I'll sort it for you. And all of a sudden, the focus child is not focused upon anymore. But the vigilant care aspect of it, of course, is, because this is what's happening. But what is also important to recognize is the teacher who asks for the support is empowered by the very fact of drawing upon support in a manner which they feel comfortable with. And the child, is working, hang on a sec, this isn't what usually happens. So the child then begins to become curious, and this happens. The child becomes curious. Now, what I've made clear to these staff is this doesn't work immediately, but over time. It may even be that the child looks for other triggers, other buttons to press. So what is important is to persist, as we say in NVR, to persist with this, because what you're doing is removing the sense of isolation that many teachers feel in the classroom. So arguably, the child over time will have that sense of security, and the heightened presence of the teacher A, will help that child to regulate itself, anchor itself in the presence of that teacher.
Oh, I love it, and see, of course, how it works and how it has worked in some of the work that you've done, Tony, in your Prue school. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about, is there a place for parents in this role? We in NVR, we bring school into home and we bring home into school. It's not what goes on in Rome stays in Rome. We immerse them both. What's your thoughts then about, is there a place for parents within this role?
You know what my answer to that is going to be. Of course
I do.
Of course, absolutely. And again, what I found most powerful is in a school I did some time ago where we did an announcement, and where we had to bring the parents in. Dad was on the phone, Mum was present, and that we did an announcement to the child. And the requirement, if you like, is probably not a great word for it, but what we asked the parent was, there are certain things that you need to stop doing so that you're in alignment with how the approaches the school are taking. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to do that in a very short, maybe half an hour meeting. But what was really powerful was witnessing the parents' presence grow as they took part in that announcement. And this was a child on the verge of exclusion. And I remember contacting the school a while because I heard nothing. I said, well, how is the child getting on? Oh, yeah, he's fine. So I say, okay, so he's excluded or not excluded? Oh, no, he's just back into classroom. Again, disappears into the mass. Parents really pleased. Now, we know it's not that straightforward, and that was because it takes a long time. But definitely, once the parents get on board with these ideas and give themselves permission also to let things go and not to try to manage every small thing that the child does, it becomes very powerful. And parent and school alliance is incredibly powerful. As Chaim Omer himself says, it's essential for the well-being of the child and everybody else around that child.
I was thinking, can you say a bit more? You've spoken quite a lot about the planning. How does one plan if not everyone is on the same song sheet? And in the school environment, how do we plan for that? How do we manage, those kind of differences?
Okay, that's the zillion-dollar question, really, isn't it? Because the one thing I find is essential is has to be buy-in from leadership, unquestionably. And that in itself does not guarantee that everybody else is going to be on board, particularly if we're talking about culture change. Because culture change is shifting everybody over to a different way of operating, and not everybody will want to do that. So I find it useful working with this particular school is identifying maybe so first of all we've got buy-in from the leadership, and identifying teachers who are curious about NVR and different ways. Particularly though, and this is the amazing thing about NVR, when you're offering them a sense of you can relax a little bit with NVR. If you're heightened and you believe that you have to control every aspect of every child in your classroom, you will burn out very quickly. And I give you a little short example. I had another school, and goes years back, and there was a particular child I was focusing on. The teacher had cornered herself the way she had designed her classroom. She had blocked herself into a corner in order to manage one particular child. Mm-hmm. And I said, why have you placed yourself there? You need to be out and about among the classroom, among the children. And she said, I need to stay there so I can keep an eye on so-and-so. And this child knew that he was, as we say, had the logic of control. He was controlling the situation, how she managed her life in that classroom. So you can imagine how stressed and how stressful that must have been for her. So I said, my focus with her was, you cannot do this on your own. Get support in, but you have to be allowed to turn your back on that child. Otherwise, they know that they are in control. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And that careful planning and positioning, and a parent said a couple of months ago, actually I don't always know what I'm going to do in the moment, but I have a planned response later, and that striking when the iron is cold, we can come back to that. It's okay if it doesn't go according to the plan. I remember Peter sharing a long time ago an example of some work he was doing with some teachers in a school, and an LSA, a very amazing, incredible learning support assistant, was helping Peter with this young person, and this young person was at the break times, hot-footing over an 8-foot fence and running off down the road. And between Peter and the LSA and the school, they decided that they would open the gate of the school. Do you remember, and so the teachers, the rest of the staff were like, well, if you open the gate, he'll run, and so it went to the break time, and this kid went outside to have his break with the LSA. It was an individual break time, no other kids around. And the LSA went straight over and opened this gate from this huge fence. The gate opened, and the kid looked at the LSA, and the LSA said, I'm really worried when you jump over that fence that you're going to hurt yourself. If I open the gate for you, at least I know when you run, you're not going to hurt yourself.
Yeah.
So the $1 million question is, did the boy run?
I think probably not.
No.
Because the trigger, the button has been removed. That element of control has been removed. And we did something similar in the Peru. When I started there, the doors were locked. And of course, this just made the young people kick the doors in.
Of course.
Well, I said, open the doors. But if we open the doors, this and that happened. No, open the doors. And then we had what we call an open door policy as in any mainstream school. And therefore, game over. So they, okay, we'll just go into lesson, sit down, because there's no point.
So there's no point for the child to hop the fence because the gate's open. The teacher communicates that the gate is open because the teacher was concerned of the boy hurting himself.
Yeah.
The child then doesn't run because there's no cat and mouse now. He's taken the fun out of it, the sting out of it. There's no control. I guess for the remaining teachers that were gasping that the gate had been left open for this child to, is, the voices of, so you're just going to let him run out, that critical, prescriptive voice. How do teachers who are working in isolation manage that, Tony, in your opinion?
I think you said it earlier on. I think it's the planning and the acceptance that you were not in that child's case. It was going to happen, and then you removing the risk of the child hurting themselves. But this is not easy, and it requires people to come on board with the whole safeguarding versus NVR the tension that is often there. But if the child is going to go anyway, opening that gate and being present with that child is actually enough in that case. I would argue some people will come against that. But there really is an issue around this when it comes to what do teachers think is going to happen? Will this all lead to everything falling apart? And it is, again, I come back to leadership and being able to convince people that this ultimately leads to a more relaxed atmosphere, and this is what the children want. They want to be around people who are not anxious, who are secure in themselves, as I said at the beginning. And this means then this is what they want. They want to be present with these people. These are okay. And I remember working in a Peru was really challenging, because what you had was young people whose lives were so challenging. All they wanted to be was children. And they would only be children with people around whom they felt secure. And for me, I loved break time, watching them all play basketball. And the best example of this, we had Monopoly on a Friday afternoon, which went on well after school closed. Why? They were playing and they didn't cheat and they loved it. And it was, that is where, because we created an environment where they felt secure, not locked in, not anxious people. And it gives people license to feel relaxed around young people who very often are used to people feeling insecure around. Does that make sense? Sorry, I'm probably wittering on a bit here.
No, I think we could talk forever. I know our time has come to an end. I just think it flies past, doesn't it?
It does.
I guess it would be wonderful to summarise just what I've learned. I think there's that top-down approach, leadership, senior teachers being able to develop and create these new ways of being, support for all of the teaching staff on every level to help them feel less isolated and alone, which mirrors the same principles for as we coach families to feel less alone managing these harmful behaviours.
And this in itself requires people to trust themselves, to do things differently, and to be able to let certain things go in order to focus on the much more serious aspects of these young people's lives. To me, NVR has offered me one of the most powerful aspects of it is the vigilant care. That is just an amazing structure. Open attention. Go in not expecting to find anything wrong or anticipating anything wrong happening, but go in with a view, just be alert as any parent would be, and relax. I can't put it better than that. It's easier said than done. But that to me is what NVR has done for me.
It's amazing. Did you see the Dad's Patrol video on YouTube a couple of months ago? Did you?
I did.
I might put it on the end of the podcast link for listeners to access, where a timetable of 42 dads got together in a I think it's a Californian school. There was lots of fighting, and a timetable of dads, just dads, came in every sort of, they did a rota every day and just showed their presence at the beginning and end of every day for the kids to see. It's a really interesting clip, and I will add it to the bio on the podcast. But it's really important that people understand it's not a question of just getting 42 dads together and saying, okay, go there. They have to go in with a state of mind. You're there to simply be present, to tell off, not to engage or interfere in a manner which is aggressive or anything like that. They need to have the proper mindset, and I think but done well. And just think the beauty of it. They're relaxed. They're there. And I think that is what I find really interesting about NVR. I mean, it's just those teachers I remember in school. Sorry, I know I'm wittering on a bit, but anyway. Those teachers in school and this is the one thing I want to knock on the head, this a view that certain teachers have the X factor. They have that presence, and only them. Nobody can explain it. I don't think it's rubbish. I think what we have to do is accept that we can develop, nurture, cultivate presence in teachers, and doing the way we've described things today can help towards that. I won't say any more. Oh, Tony, I could listen to you forever. That was so lovely. Thanks for your time. I think it's been really interesting.
Anytime, Rachel.
Cool. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.